Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm so glad that you're here. A brief note before we begin. There will be a large event happening in this auditorium immediately following our lecture this morning. So we will end promptly at 9, and we will move across to the conference room A just across the hallway for continued meeting and greeting with our guest speaker, as well as additional opportunities for questions and answers. So please plan to join us in person in Rangos Room A following today's lecture when we conclude right at 9 o'clock. The other event that I want to draw your attention to is that today, as we gather at 12:45, will be the annual White Coats Against Racism and Injustice, our meal on the front lawn. In a moment when the news is heartbreaking, and for those that it feels most hurtful to, silence can feel like complicity. I invite every UPMC staff member and physician in white coat to join us on the front lawn to take a kneel as a moment to take a stand against what you stand for, which is against injustice and racism, and our work towards equity and respect for all. And now I'd like to talk today about our Grand Rounds and welcome you to the annual Laura Whitehead Lecture. I'd like to first warmly welcome Laura Whitehead's husband, Peter Thorne, who joins us remotely today. Today's lecture in honor of Laura commemorates that Laura was a pediatric resident here at Children's Hospital from 1984 to 1987. She was a wonderful resident, smart, dedicated, warm, and compassionate. And she was particularly interested and passionate about the care for children with a variety of psychosocial challenges, including children living in poverty and with limited resources. Laura's work served as an inspiration to many of the residency programs that we have today to further our residents' education and passions in this area. After graduation, Laura served as pediatric chief resident at Mercy Hospital, where her interest in community health and care to the underserved continued to develop. Laura died unexpectedly midway through her chief year, leaving her husband and young son, her parents and siblings devastated by the sudden loss of this young, spirited woman and promising physician. And today we honor her. Laura's family and friends and colleagues established this annual lectureship in her memory and with the intent to educate, stimulate, and motivate the medical community to consider the issues that have reflected Laura's sensibilities and concern. And previous Whitehead lecturers have considered the medical problems associated with poverty, aspects of public policy, and bioethical issues, as well as other similar topics. Again, I'd like to welcome Laura's family today. Today, our annual Whitehead speaker is Dr. Lois Lee. Dr. Lee's work focuses on pediatric emergency medicine, injuries, health disparities, and health policy. This is grounded in her clinical work as a pediatric emergency room physician at Boston Children's Hospital and is associate professor of pediatrics and emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School. At Boston Children's Hospital, she's the Associate Program Director for Public Policy at the new Sandra Fenwick Institute for Pediatric Health Equity and Inclusion. Dr. Lee received her medical degree at the Perlman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. She completed a residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and a pediatric emergency medicine fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. During that time, she received her MPH at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and she was also the inaugural Nick Littlefield Health Policy Fellow at the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation in 2016 to 17. Dr. Lee has published seminal research on pediatric emergency medicine, health disparities, and injury prevention, including related to firearms. With her expertise, she is the chair of the AAP's Council on Injury, Violence, and Poison Prevention. She's the inaugural director of the Academic Pediatrics Association's Health Policy Scholars Program, a career development program focused on health policy and advocacy. And if you have any interest in this program, please reach out to Dr. Lee today. She would love to talk with you about it. And she just told me we don't have anyone from Pittsburgh, so maybe now is the time. She's the co-chair of the Advocacy Committee and member of the Executive Council of the Society of Pediatric Research and a member of the Pediatric Policy Council that represents SPR, APO, and APS. With her passion for improving the lives of children, she promotes child health through her clinical work, research, teaching, and advocacy. I'm very much looking forward to this hour together, and I welcome Dr. Lee.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for everybody here in person and online. So today, my lecture is entitled Crossing Lines, Applying Lessons from Child Passenger Safety to Firearm Injury Prevention. My only disclosure is I receive royalties from this book. Oh, okay. So I did want to acknowledge that yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the horrible shooting at the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, where these children and their teachers were shot and killed last year. A lot has changed, but a lot has unfortunately stayed the same. And although when we read about these things, sometimes it's easy to think, wow, that's really terrible that that happened there. Then you see a headline like this and realize that it just happened down the street. And I know that for those of you who care for the children in the community here in Pittsburgh, that this is unfortunately not a rare event. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about the really crisis of firearm death and injuries to our children today. So the take-home points for my talk are, number one, that firearms are the leading cause of death now for children in the United States. And I always, when I give this talk, it makes me think, what kind of country do we live in that we have let this happen? Because that is what it is. We have let this happen. No other country has this problem. But I also do know that a multi-pronged scientific approach, like what is used for motor vehicles, and that's really the point of the lecture today, can be applied for firearm injury prevention. But we also know, being here at an academic center, that research is critical to advance the science, but advocacy is also important to decrease firearm injuries and deaths. So I started with some sobering, stories, news stories, but I'm hoping that at the end that this is really a message of hope. This is a picture of Alessandro Volta's museum in Lake Como, Italy. So I was lucky enough to be there in April. I don't know if anybody can guess what Alessandro Volta invented, but it was actually the battery. So in this little teeny weeny town in the base of the lake in Italy, this man invented the battery, and I'm sure he had no idea back then that it would lead to things like the iPhone and the Tesla. What you'll see in the front of this building is, on the left-hand side, you see a statue that represents science. And on the right-hand side, you see a statue that represents faith. And I think it's really those two things that we need. We need the science, but we also need the faith that we can make a change, because without that, our children will continue to suffer. So the actual learning objectives for my talk today are, number one, to really examine some of the epidemiology, but also disparities of firearm injuries. And then we want to analyze strategies to decrease motor vehicle crash injuries to understand how we can apply that to firearms. And then thirdly, to discuss the importance of research and advocacy in decreasing pediatric injuries. So this was an article we published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that's the title of the talk today, Crossing Lines. And what you'll see on the x-axis is time, going from 2000 to 2020. And on the y-axis, you see the firearm death rate for children 1 to 24 years of age. And we chose the bottom age of 1 because before that, there are other causes of death that are much more prevalent. And we chose the age up to 24, and there's some controversy in the injury researchers, because some people are like, well, those are really young adults. But as pediatricians, we know we do take care of these young adults in our practice. And so the top line, the orange line, represents motor vehicle crashes. So you'll see for decades, and even for decades before 2000, was the leading cause of death for kids, and also an important cause of death for adults. But here in 2017, the lines crossed, and then firearms became the number one cause of death, of all causes of death, more than cancer, more than infections, more than congenital diseases of death of children in the United States. But we know death is literally just the tip of what we call the injury pyramid. So you have death, hospitalizations, emergency departments, and then all those other injuries that are cared for at home or in the outpatient clinic. So between 2011 and 2020, in that 10-year block, we had nearly 500,000 children who either were killed or injured from firearms in the United States. The left-hand circle represents firearm deaths. And so what you'll see is about 2/3 of firearm deaths are firearm homicide. This is actually the opposite for adults, where 2/3 are firearm suicide. So again, when you're thinking about injury prevention, this is not a monolith, right? So how you are going to deal with suicide prevention is very different than how you're going to deal with homicide prevention. But not surprisingly, since 2/3 of firearm deaths in kids are from homicide, then the majority of unintentional shooting injuries are from assault. But still importantly, right, 1/3 of firearm deaths in kids are to suicide. And so definitely a group that we can, focus on. And then a smaller percentage unintentional shooting. But still, there are prevention strategies we can think about there. So to kind of put those large numbers onto a smaller scale, that might be easier to kind of grasp. On our current trajectory, we know every year we'll have over 10,000 children killed by firearms in the United States. And that's about one school bus full every 3 days. So if we had a school bus full of children who drove off a cliff and they died every 3 days, we know exactly what people would do, right? You would build a barrier, you would put a lot of signs, you'd have flashing lights, you'd put something at the base of the cliff or find a different way for that bus to go, right? But even though this is happening in front of us in real time every day, we have not found a way, right, to prevent this bus from crashing off a cliff every 3 days. And so why is that? Well, according to the last census, we have about 330 million people in the United States. I want you just to take a moment to think, well, how many guns do we have in the United States? So you can think about that online, virtually, or in this space. But it turns out we have somewhere over 450 million guns, but we actually do not know how many guns we have in the United States, because in the United States, you are not required to license and register your gun like you are your motor vehicle. So in the United States, we know exactly how many motor vehicles we have. We know who they belong to. We know what insurance company covers them. We do not have this information. And in some states, you really don't have to have any information about who owns firearms. And so we really have no idea. And those are even the ones that are sold legally, right? And then we have all the ones sold illegally in traffic that we don't know. So the point is, a lot of guns and a lot more guns than we have people. And these guns stick around for a long time. They even last longer than cars, right? And so just to sort of out how many guns we have in the United States. So about 44% of US households have actually one or more guns or firearms. So that's Pennsylvania. And you look at the color-coded sort of bar chart, somewhere about 40 to 50%. And again, people own firearms for different reasons. In this part of the state, a lot of times it would be actually for hunting and sport, but may also be for self-protection. And again, the messages for safety are sometimes the same, but also different depending on why you have a firearm. I live in Massachusetts, which has this is less than 10%. And so there is overall a very low firearm ownership rate. But it also changes by demographic. So in general, in the United States, more of the white population own firearms, more in the rural areas, and more Republicans than other political parties. And so we have seen changing trends across the United States on firearms, suicide, and homicide. So this was a paper we published last fall in JAMA Network Open. And you'll see maps crossing over time. So on the far left is 1999 to 2001, then 2008 to 2010, and then 2014 to 2016, which was the latest data we had available from the CDC. And the maps on the top are suicide and the maps on the bottom are homicide. And basically the red are the highest rates of firearm deaths. So again, on the top is suicide and the bottom is homicide. And I think you can see visually that the red actually marches across and you see more and more red. And then there's Pennsylvania across the three eras. Not such a big change in Pennsylvania, but you can see in other states, especially kind of on the western side, a lot more firearm suicides are occurring now. And then you can see kind of a wave of homicide increasing more in the southern states. But again, firearm injuries and deaths don't affect all populations equally. So this is just shows some of the disparities. And these are disparities that have been long known in the injury community, but have not really been of interest until more recently to the general public or to politicians. So on the x-axis here, we have ages going from 0 all the way to 85 plus. And again, on the y-axis, we have the firearm fatality rate. And what you'll notice is there's this huge peak, right, of the yellow line, which represents Black non-Hispanic youth from ages kind of 15 to 19 to 39. And it turns out that compared to white young adult males, Black males are killed at rates 24 times higher than their peers. We also see higher rates, but not nearly as high, right? But still higher rates in American Indian, Alaska Native youth, and Hispanic males. So these are males only, because firearm homicide affects males much greater rates than females. Suicide also affects males more than females, but a little bit more equally here. And the point of this figure is really to show changes in all racial and ethnic groups over time. And so here on the x-axis, you see time going from 2010 to 2020. And when we're thinking about suicide, we're looking at older age groups. So this is ages 10 to 24, I believe. And then you have firearm fatality rates for suicide on the y-axis. And what you'll see is that very top line represents American Indian and Alaska Native youth. So actual numbers are not very high because relatively speaking, it's a smaller population, proportion of the population in the United States. But you see that their numbers have steadily gone up over time. But then you actually see that the percentages have gone up for all groups. And so, for example, I'll take Asian. I identify as Asian. We had very few firearm-related suicides back in 2010. So even though our rates are still not high, the actual percentage has increased 200% in the last 10 years. And again, part of that's just more firearms being available as families have been buying them. It's not just about race and ethnicity and geography, it's also about your socioeconomic status. So this was a study that we did looking at the poverty of the county where you live. So not the poverty level of the individual, but we were categorizing counties by the percent of the county living below the federal poverty level. So this is all compared to the lowest poverty level, which is 0 to 5% are living below the federal poverty level. And on the x-axis, you'll see goes from 5 to 9.9% to greater than 20%. So those counties that have greater than 20% living below the federal poverty level are the most impoverished counties. And on the y-axis, you see the adjusted incidence rate ratio. And this is specifically for firearm suicide. And what you'll see is there's clearly increased adjusted incidence rate ratio for firearm suicide, and it increases progressively as your county level poverty increases. We did a similar study looking at firearm homicide and found a similar pattern. So it's not just about the individual's socioeconomic status, but about kind of the environment where they live. And this is even after controlling for other sort of state and individual level factors. So that's a little bit about the epidemiology and disparities around firearms. So now we're going to talk really about the meat of the talk, which is really kind of thinking about what are some strategies we have. Because when we see these headlines nationally, locally, it's hard to think, well, how do we move forward when we're in such a politically divided climate, right? But I think the one good thing we have as a pediatrician is everybody, or nearly everybody, agrees that we want to take care of our kids. We want to keep our kids safer. And when you come with that frame, it's actually a lot easier to talk about, because people are like, well, how can you talk about this? How can you research this? But when you take it from the perspective of I'm trying to help kids, it gets your foot in the door a lot easier. So a similar graph to the crossing lines graph, but I'm kind of going back to 1990 so that you have a little bit of perspective. So we're going to start our journey here, where the motor vehicle is the leading cause of death, and then we're going to kind of look at where we've come with motor vehicles over time. So any of those of you, and I see Chris Vitale, who's from the injury program here, may be familiar with this concept of the Haddon matrix. So Bill Haddon was a physician who basically put it out there that, injuries are not actually accidents. Like, we actually can predict that these are going to happen. And injuries to the body occur, right, when the transfer of energy, which could be thermal, could be electrical, could be chemical, or in the case that I'm generally talking about, physical. And that you can actually have an analytic and scientific approach to injury control to sort of think about, well, how can we mitigate or lessen, right, this physical transfer of energy to decrease injuries? So if you can eliminate or lessen the energy transfer with either active or passive measures, you can decrease injuries. So I'm going to go through an example pretty quickly about motor vehicles. So this is the Haddon matrix. Across the top, you'll see the different factors. So the human factors, us. the agent or the vehicle. So I'll talk about motor vehicles, but we're going to eventually sort of think about how this could be firearms. And then the environment, which could be really physical or social. And when we talk about social, we really mean policy or legislation. And then you think about the phase and time for the event. Are there things you can do before the event to prevent things? What can you do during the event, or what can you do post-event? So maybe the motor vehicle crashes happen, but what can we do to kind of decrease the severity of injuries? So, for example, if you're thinking about pre-event, what are some things that we can sort of prevent the injury? So if you think about human factors, right? If you've been drinking, that's going to both increase your risk of getting into a crash, but also your ability to react during a crash. Excuse me. During the event, so maybe a crash is happening, but if you're a very experienced driver, you're going to react very differently than my 16-year-old the very first day she took her car out and maybe something happened, right? So how do you respond during the crash? And then what is your general health, right? So if you're in a crash and you have no health problems and your bones are strong and you're physically strong, very different from somebody who may have osteoporosis or may have some other physical ailments. What is the status of your car? Are you driving, the latest car with all the bells and whistles for safety, or are you driving an older car? Do your airbags go off, right? So again, you've been in a crash, but if the airbags go off, that protects you from a serious head injury. And then cars actually, believe it or not, used to be designed where the gas tank was next to the engine, right? We all know now that's a really bad idea, because what happens if you're in a crash and the gas tank is next to an engine? The car blows up. And then somebody realized, well, that's a dumb idea. Let's separate the gas tank from the engine, right? So they're design things that we can plan to make things safer. We're not saying you get rid of cars, right? How can we make them safer? The physical environment, right? If you live here or in Boston, on a snowy day, you have to drive differently. So what can you do to sort of prevent injuries? Or if an injury happens, I don't know if people realize, these are water barrels at the exit when you're getting off a highway, because if you get into a crash, rather than hitting that hard metal rail, this decreases that physical impact. So even though you're in a crash, you decrease the injury to the body. And then let's say a crash has happened, very different, right? If you're on a kind of quieter 2-lane road and the ambulance can get to you versus a very busy highway and there's cars whizzing by. And then what are the general laws, right? So things that can prevent a crash even before it happens, speed limits are really important. And again, that whole thought of the drinking and driving, the laws in the states can really deter people from driving, and some places have much stronger laws around penalties if you've been drinking and driving. And then what's your EMS capability, right? So if you're in a crash in Wyoming and it takes an hour for an ambulance to get to you and then an hour for you to get to a medical center, very different, right? Than if you get in a motor vehicle crash right here in the city and you can immediately go to a top medical center, in 10 minutes. So even if you have injuries, your ability to survive them is very different. So hopefully this is just kind of a quick walkthrough. We can be very intentional and think about things before, during, and after, and then think about the different factors that are involved and how we can actually prevent injuries. But everybody, clearly, motor vehicles are much easier to talk about than firearms. But there are things that we can do. So one of the things is there have been continuous improvements in safety efforts for motor vehicles because we have federal agencies that are actively involved. We have the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and their whole job is to make roads and cars safer for all of us. There's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and that's a partial nonprofit and also governmental organization. And again, insurance, right? So they're actually very invested in making sure that your cars are safe. And then the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission is also a federal agency that is tasked with making sure that other things that go in the car, like the car seats, are safe as well. So that, right, is how we are now here, where we have had such a dramatic decrease in motor vehicle crashes over time because there's been a very intentional effort to make sure that we are making cars and roads safer. But what has happened to firearms? So just again, as a comparison, in 2020, for youth 1 to 24 years old in the United States, we had 7,820 motor vehicle crash deaths. Still too many, right? Still things we can do. However, we had over 10,000 deaths among kids the same age for firearms. But there are actually levers for change. So that hopefully this is where the kind of hope part comes in, right? That there are actually things we can do. So there are human factors related to communication and cultural change. And those of us who are old enough to remember, I think we can feel that cultural shift. Like nobody talked about firearms before. And literally the CDC was not allowed to use the word firearms until about 5 years ago, right? So we're seeing this cultural shift where we can talk about it and actually everybody wants to do something about it. But there are actually things we can do about the firearm as well. So this is a safety cap, right? Like we need medications, but how do we keep our kids from, not taking medications they're not supposed to? And there's actually regulations we can think about. And then as far as the environment, there's both policy, legal policy, but as well as the built environment that can change, that we can make differences in firearm injuries and deaths. So I'm going to kind of go through some of these quickly. So communication and cultural change. So again, for those of us who remember back in the 70s, nobody wore a seatbelt. It just wasn't a thing. Nobody did it. There were really no regulations. But now almost everybody, like actually more than 85% of United States residents wear seatbelts. And that's just kind of a given, but that's not what it used to be. So there was this cultural sort of change over time. And actually the way cars were designed made it easier to wear seatbelts as well. And so now we actually can talk about safer or secure storage. Again, I'm going to point out Chris there. We were talking, she has been quietly and persistently trying to do firearm safety education here, even at a time where perhaps it wasn't really encouraged. And now she's able to get funding for the program, have gun safes as well as gun locks. So we can talk about this, talk about if you are going to have a firearm in the home, the safest way or the more secure way to have it in your home is to have it unloaded, to have the ammunition and the firearm separately stored away and locked away so that your children can't access it. And the whole idea is not that nobody accesses it, right? We just want people who shouldn't access it, right? We don't want a 3-year-old shooting their 4-year-old brother. We don't want an impulsive, 15-year-old who decides that they got a bad grade at school and they now want to end their life to find a firearm and shoot themselves. We're just trying to prevent, right, unauthorized access. And other things related to cultural change. So again, I know I'm dating myself, but back in the 70s, very common for people to drink and drive. Like you went to a cocktail party, you went to a party and you drove home, right? The whole designated driver thing didn't really start occurring till the 1980s. But we've had this cultural shift where it is actually, not acceptable to drink while intoxicated. And then hopefully if you're using other substances, which are now legal, that will also come into play. Again, we've had this cultural shift where, people, the American public, right, are concerned, upset, and they want the government to do something. And there's actually product designs that we can do to firearms. So again, these are a couple of things for motor vehicles, airbags, and then car seats. Again, in the 70s, nobody was in car seats. You would drive home holding your baby in the front seat, and you weren't wearing a seatbelt either. So, but now, right, you can't actually leave the hospital until you have a car seat for your child. So it turns out you actually can make safer guns. I don't know, has anybody, show of hands in the room, anybody seen anything like this before? Right, Allison. Thank you, Allison. This is a personalized smart gun. And so this basically can read your fingerprint and only allow you or others who are authorized to use the firearm. So you can't pull the trigger unless it recognizes you by your fingerprint. And I would actually argue this is old technology, right? Our phones don't even need a finger anymore. They just see your face, and then your phone opens up. So it is possible to build something safer so that a 3-year-old can't just pull the trigger, right? I was trying to light a candle the other day with one of those 2-handed Bic lighters, and I was having trouble doing that. But the 3-year-old can shoot a firearm, right? So there are things we can do to make things safer. And this is actually available. This is clearly a picture of something that actually exists, but not available on the US consumer market. And then other regulations, right? So we have lots of regulations around toys. For example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission makes sure that the paint on this car, right, isn't toxic if your child decides to lick it, or if the wheels come off, that they don't choke on anything. And same for the stuffing on the teddy bear and the, have to make sure the eyes don't come off and become a choking hazard. But we have nothing for firearms. Firearms actually are federally regulated, that they can have no safety regulations. So something that is built for only one thing, which is to maim or kill, has 0 safety regulations, and there's actually a law saying they cannot be regulated for safety. And so again, for firearms, we have several federal agencies that are tasked only with trying to make motor vehicles safer for us, and it has been successful, right? That's really the point. This has been successful, but we have nothing for firearms. We do have the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm organization. That is a federal organization, but it is a law enforcement agency and not a safety agency, and had no director for the 5 years before President Biden became president. And then there are things we can do in the physical environment. So again, this is an example of trying to keep us safer on the road. We actually know that if you take vacant lots and you make safer playgrounds and you make spaces greener, especially in urban areas, that you can actually make those urban areas safer and decrease firearm violence. So these are things that can be done on the local level. So again, on the federal level, as an individual, sometimes that feels like, well, what can I do, right? We'll talk about what you can do, but that feels a little bit harder to do. But in cities around the country, actually through the Injury-Free Coalition for Kids, we built playgrounds. Chris, did you guys build a playground here? Yes. Yes. So thanks to leadership of Chris and her injury prevention team, we built 3 playgrounds in the city of Pittsburgh, and we've done that around the country through our organization. And then legislation. So again, talking about motor vehicles, we have a lot of legislation around, speed limits, very different if you're in Montana or Wyoming. But again, long roads, not a lot of people versus, if you're here in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. This is a picture of the celebration of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year. And the gentleman speaking is Dr. Guerrero, who was the only pediatrician in Uvalde, Texas, and the pediatrician of several of the students who were shot and killed last year. Then just if you'll indulge me, I was actually invited to be a part of the celebration. This is Dr. Moira Szilagyi, who was last year's AAP president. And she testified on behalf of all the pediatricians in the United States for the AAP in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I was actually testifying for a different House subcommittee about gun trafficking, but because of the work I've done with the AAP, they were kind enough to invite me to be her +1. And what I will say is this celebration was really quite remarkable because it looked to me like a slice of America. It was not all researchers. It was mostly not researchers. There were clearly faith communities. There were communities from all over the United States. There were survivors. There were victims. There were families. And they were really trying to make sure that they reached out to everybody who had done work in this space or who had been impacted by this as much as they could. Obviously, they couldn't have everybody. And it was really a wonderful celebration. So I'm going to talk a moment about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act because this was really the first legislation in over 25 years on a federal standpoint around firearms. There's been a lot of work in states on the state level on firearms, but that's both increasing firearm legislation. Like in my state, we have over 100 laws, but we have a representative who actually wants to pass more laws. But that, as a result, we have very low firearm prevalence and low firearm deaths. And then there's other states that are actually pulling back laws and making it more permissive, for example, to have just open concealed carry. So you can buy a gun and conceal it and just carry it wherever you want with no sort of registration or permission. So, and we know in those states that firearm violence is increasing. So this was the first federal legislation. The last legislation actually that had been passed was the assault weapons ban you may have heard of. That was passed in 1996 after the attempted assassination of President Reagan. However, it was sunset after 10 years because that was sort of how it was built into the law, and then they just never reactivated it. So that's why there's no federal assault weapons ban. So what this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act focused on were basically these sort of 6 things. It increased background checks, but it's not universal background checks. So right now, in many states, the federal law is basically you have to have a universal background check if you buy a firearm in a federally licensed firearm dealer. Now, there are other ways you can buy firearms like gun shows, auctions, private sales. So there are places where firearms can be purchased that you don't necessarily have to have a background check. This background check part of the law only increased it for those 18 to 21. And that again was a compromise, but most studies have shown that the majority of mass shootings are defined as 4 or more people killed in a shooting are in that age group. Now, that's not everybody. The recent shooter in Nashville, Tennessee was older than 21 and was also a woman, which is a little bit unusual, but this at least was something, right? And then they had more protections around perpetrators of domestic violence. The gavel is to talk a little bit about extreme risk protection order laws. So that was basically, that's a state-based law, but this sort of federal law put more money and resources into trying to get those passed in the states. And I'll talk about that as well, because Pennsylvania does not have one, although it's going through your legislature right now. They wanted put in stronger protections around gun trafficking. This federal law would also cover doing background checks for firearms sold at gun shows and things like that, and also put a lot of money into mental health services. Now, we all know, right, that mental health is not the cause of the firearm epidemic. However, we know that we're also in a mental health epidemic, not just for our kids, but also throughout the country. So I think we were happy that there are resources and money being put into mental health. But to be clear, we know that those with mental health disorders are much more likely to be victims than a perpetrator. So a moment about extreme risk protection order laws, also known as RIPO laws or red flag laws. And these laws basically allow a court or a judge to kind of rapidly prevent an at-risk individual from either purchasing or possessing a gun. So somebody puts something out on social media that they want to shoot up a school, or somebody tells, a family member that they're suicidal, then that family member or mental health clinician or primary care provider or anybody or law enforcement can go to court. And actually the court will temporarily, depends on the state, 6 months to a year, take away or prevent firearm purchasing from an individual. Again, trying to prevent a shooting or a suicide. And early studies have shown that one suicide would be prevented for every 10 to 20 risk warrants that are issued. So that was from data from Connecticut. And also in Connecticut and Indiana have shown lower firearm suicide rates. And early data from California actually showing that this law may be decreasing mass shootings as well. And so as of last year, or actually, 2022, 19 states and the District of Columbia passed it. We're starting to see actually a lot more activity in a lot of other states. So again, in Pennsylvania, something that's being considered in the legislature. So something that you can do as a constituent is actually reaching out to your state legislator to say that you're in support of this. So that's sort of where we are with some strategies, both at the state and federal level, and just even culturally, the fact that we can talk about this is really important to kind of move to the next step. So now I'm going to sort of focus on the last part of the talk, which is illustrating the importance of research, which I don't have to point out to you easily, luckily, but also advocacy, right, in decreasing pediatric injuries and deaths from firearms. So this is an article published in the New England Journal in 1993 by Dr. Arthur Kellerman and his colleagues, and it was called Gun Ownership as a Risk Factor for Homicide in the Home. And they basically took all these police reports from King County, Washington, and that's where Seattle is located, and they literally read like all the cases about what happened. And then they categorized them as self-protection homicide. So that's, again, somebody comes into your home trying to, steal something and you're trying to protect yourself. Unintentional shootings. So, criminal homicide. So that's a intimate partner violence situation. Suicide, you see how many suicides happened there, and then unknown. And basically what they found was excluding suicide, which clearly was the most common reason there was a gun shooting in the home. Members of a household were 18 times more likely to be killed than a stranger, right? So when people say, I want to have a firearm in my home for self-protection, this basically really questioned that tenet. And what the authors concluded in this article were that people who keep guns in their homes appear to be at greater risk of homicide in the home than people who do not. Most of this risk is due to a substantially greater risk of homicide at the hands of a family member, right, intimate partner violence, or intimate acquaintance. We did not find evidence of a protective effect. So this article angered many people in Congress, a pro-gun Congress at that time, and so in 1996, the federal response of the pro-gun Congress that was supported by the NRA was they actually attempted to eliminate the National Center for Injury Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. All right. Thankfully, they were not able to actually do that. However, they did eliminate $2.6 million from the CDC budget, which was the amount of funding that had been appropriated for firearm research the year before. And most of you have heard of the Dickey Amendment, so now you have a little bit more information. Literally said, none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control. Now, it doesn't say all firearm, research, but it was interpreted as all firearm research. So pretty much after this, most firearm research funding was completely cut off from the CDC. So by 2012, funding was banned for firearm research from the CDC. And by 2013, that basically decreased by 96%, so that only $100,000 of the CDC's entire $5.6 billion budget was earmarked for firearms. And I think that was mostly like violence prevention type programs, which is important, right, but not enough. And now background check data are destroyed within 24 hours. That happened back in 2004. So we literally have no information about people who own firearms. We have all the information we want about motor vehicle owners, which is very useful, and the publicly available database that's very easy to get lots of great data. We have no data essentially on firearm owners. And then most databases associated with firearm purchasing were eliminated or made unavailable. And then actually that 2012 date is that the NIH also stopped funding anything related to firearms. And so what happens when you have no funding for firearms? You don't have a lot of people doing research on firearms, that's basically what happens. So my colleague, Rebecca Cunningham, who's at the University of Michigan, did this study, and it looked at the relationship between research funding and firearm mortality, and they looked at the age group 1 to 18 years old from 2008 to 2017. And I point out 2017 because we did start to get some firearm funding in 2020. On the x-axis, you simply have mortality, number of deaths, right? So I've circled firearm injury. Not surprisingly, a lot of deaths from firearms. That's what we've been talking about, right? And then the y-axis is funding in millions on a logarithmic scale. So firearms, lots of deaths, not a lot of funding, right? Way below the 95th percentile. And then for comparison, cancer, a lot of deaths, right? And appropriately a lot of funding, but above the 95th percentile. And then just, for kicks, there's tetanus, 0 deaths, almost the same amount of funding as firearms. Just let you think about that for a minute, right? So that's what happens when you have no research, right? You don't have, you're just not going to have funding. You're not going to have research. So let's also talk not just about research funding, but also about firearm laws. So this is from the Everytown for Gun Safety website. So if you're interested to learn more sort of about what's going on in the United States around firearms in general, but also about laws, this is a great source. And so this website on this page, they're actually ranking states by how successful they are with sort of firearm legislation and firearm mortality. So this looks at state gun law strength and gun violence rate. So Pennsylvania is in the second tier, which is called making progress, which is better than the lowest tier, which they're not making progress. They're kind of going backwards, I would say. So right now ranked 15 out of 50. And this on the left-hand side where it's blue, you see the gun law strength. And so Pennsylvania gun law strength is 40. That's on a scale of 0 to 100. So, not bad, but room for improvement. And the gun violence rate is 14.8 over 100,000 people. And so again, kind of I would say in the high middle ground, okay, over when you're comparing all the states. And why is it important to think about state laws? So this was a study we did now actually a while ago looking at firearm legislation and firearm related fatalities. And this is of all ages and all different kinds of laws. And basically what we showed is that if you had a higher legislative strength score, that there was a 42% reduction in overall firearm related fatalities. So here's Massachusetts with lots of laws, low firearm fatality rate, Louisiana, not so many laws, and high firearm fatality rate, and again, Pennsylvania kind of in the middle. So what can we do, right? Now we're going, that was the science, now we're going to hopefully talk a little bit about the hope part. So I would say advocate both at your state level, trying to communicate with your legislators at the state level, but also the federal level. And I was telling at dinner last night, I worked in the senator's office, your emails and your calls, most of the senators and the representatives actually have communication staff, and they catalog every email, every call, and they actually say, okay, these people called about Medicare, these people called about firearms. And that's actually what helped the Bipartisan Communities Act pass, because for the first time, for example, in Ohio, more people called saying this needs to pass than the naysayers who said, you better not vote for that, otherwise I'm not voting for you. So if so they actually, we're starting to see again that cultural shift. So we published last year in Pediatrics the technical report and policy statement on firearm-related injuries and deaths in children and youth. So if you want to read more information kind of just on the background, where the policy statement talks a little bit more about what are some specific policies that the AAP is recommending. So where do we go from here? We need to increase research funding. We need to promote more firearm safer storage laws. So in Pennsylvania, that is also being discussed right now in the legislature. Universal background checks. This is supported by like 96% of Americans and also including a majority of gun owning households as well. And then extreme risk protection order laws. So there's a lot of different things, right, that we can do. But these are 4 things that, number 1, people can talk about and are talking about. And number 2, I think are areas where we can make some traction. And again, the research funding is really a federal thing, but safer storage laws, universal background checks could be a federal thing, but also a state level thing. And then the extreme risk protection order laws, definitely state level, something I would encourage you reach out to your legislators now because that's being considered. And then research. Okay, in 2020, finally, for the first time in 25 years, Congress appropriated $25 million of research funding, which sounds like a lot until you realize that the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute has $3 billion of funding, right? So 25 million is actually not that much. And then was flat funded last year. For the last 3 years has been flat funded. So we're not making much progress, but you know, AAP and others are really trying. What can you do? I actually joined Moms Demand Action. So I'm a member of my state chapter. They have some active state chapters here in Pennsylvania, very organized. And, you know, you don't have to go to every meeting and you can kind of pick and choose what they do. But if you're interested in doing something as an individual, I would encourage you to join one of these organizations. Moms Demand is actually related to Every Town for Gun Safety as well, but they're focused on sort of really grassroots efforts. So again, you know, same figure, but now we're focusing on the firearm, right? With that dark blue line, we're seeing an uptick in firearm deaths here in the United States. And what I want us to think about is how do we go from where we are now, right, to following the trajectory of where we went with motor vehicles. So to end with my take-home points, firearms are the leading cause of death in the United States youth. But hopefully I've demonstrated how really a multi-pronged approach, like what we use for motor vehicles, can be considered for firearms. But as you already know, we need both research and advocacy to promote the science to ultimately make a change. So thank you for this very kind invitation, and I'm open for a few questions, I think.